Glenn, thanks for coming on. So I guess the first and most obvious question is, this is kind of a blockbuster story. I have no idea what it means or where it goes, but it's clearly a case where the U.S. government has been lying, has mounted a disinformation campaign, if you will, designed to cover up what it's doing. And nobody in the press corps seems interested in finding out what's at the bottom of this. Why is that?
Right. So first of all, like you, I've heard the Russian and Chinese accusations for weeks that the United States is partnering with Ukraine to have biolabs right on the other side of the Russian border, and never talked about it because there was never any evidence for it. I don't take the word of the Russians or the Chinese for it. What made me get interested in the story was when Victoria Nuland went before the Senate and Marco Rubio asked her, are there biological and chemical weapons programs in Ukraine, expecting her, he even said, I only have a minute, her to say no, of course not, so he could then claim it was debunked. But she didn't say no. In fact, she acknowledged exactly what you just went through, that not only are there labs, but they're so dangerous, whatever's in them, that they're deeply concerned it would fall into Russian hands. The other point is, any journalist who comes on the air and says that they can claim, that they can state that these concerns are false or a byproduct of disinformation, like journalists have been doing for weeks under the guise of fact-checking, is not telling the truth. All they know is that the Pentagon denies it, the CIA tells them it's not true, and then they equate that, they conflate that with proven fact, which is the #1 problem in journalism that we're seeing very pervasively in this war.
It's so shameful that anybody employed as a reporter would do something like that without doing any actual reporting whatsoever, even bothering to learn about the subject, and then to scold anyone for asking legitimate questions. So here's the problem that I have with it. Government does things that are secret. We don't always know what they are. Maybe some cases that's legitimate. But to attack anyone American citizens who ask honest questions as tools of Russia seems to me so far out of bounds. I'm worried this is being established as a precedent.
Well, as we know, this has been going on for 5 or 6 years, that anybody who questions the predominant mainstream narrative from the media, from the Democratic Party, are tools of Vladimir Putin, are Kremlin agents, are sympathizers for Moscow. This has been their tactic forever, and obviously it's escalated now. But the one point I want to make, Tucker, is when the government comes out and emphatically denies that they have biological weapons, we know they're not telling the truth. Remember the anthrax attacks right after 9/11? They were incredibly terrifying because of how weaponized they were. First, the government said it was from al-Qaeda, then they said it was from Saddam Hussein. In 2008, they said, we solved the case. Actually, it came from a U.S. Army lab, from an infectious disease specialist under the auspices of Tony Fauci, a scientist who cultivated these weaponized strains of anthrax and deployed them on U.S. soil. We know they did the same thing with the coronavirus, where they manipulated the coronavirus to become more lethal and more contagious. They claim that those aren't biological weapons because inside their brain, their intention is not to use them, but just to study them. But the things they're making are exactly the same as what you would make if you were to make biological weapons. And you have to be so careful to understand what they mean when they deny that they have these.
Well, the last question, maybe you don't know the answer, but why Ukraine? You know, of all the countries you would conduct this kind of research in, you would pick one with like a solid medical infrastructure. You'd pick Germany or Israel or someplace with, you know, first-class scientific research going on. You would not pick Ukraine. Why Ukraine?
Unless you viewed Russia as your primary threat, unless you wanted to be provocative toward the Russians, unless you wanted to be in Ukraine developing all sorts of weapons, as we clearly have been. We've been flooding that country with lethal arms for 5 or 6 years. So clearly there's an intention for the United States to be heavily involved in Ukraine. The Russians say their motive is to be threatening and provocative. The United States denies that. But they have their tentacles in Ukraine and have for many years all the time, which is a critical part of the narrative that has been lacking.
That's right. It's fair to ask, what have they been doing in Ukraine? Why are all their kids working for Ukrainian companies? What is going on here? Glenn Greenwald, I appreciate you coming on tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Tucker.